Welcome to Reformed Thinking. For the next hour, we invite you to join us in considering the weight of conviction, the process of transformation, and the principles that govern security in an unstable world.
Okay, let's unpack this. We've been given a large stack of sources examining perhaps the single most important strategic question facing Europe today.
It's certainly up there.
Under what specific realistic conditions could Ukraine join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO?
And realistic is the key word there.
It is. This aspiration is far beyond routine international politics. It's an existential security challenge for Kyiv, one driven by the prolonged aggression experience since 2014.
Right. This isn't a choice. It's a necessity from their perspective.
So the material we have access to cuts through all the diplomatic rhetoric. Our mission is to look only at the cold, hard, legal, military, and political realities that define this pathway.
Analyzing the steep constraints and the stringent conditions both Ukraine and the alliance must meet.
Before Article 5 can possibly apply. When we talk about NATO accession, we need to strip away any notion that this is a simple political alliance or a social club.
It's not the G7 or the UN.
Not at all. NATO is a system of mutual defense built on a legally binding treaty. Expanding the alliance is therefore a massive decision. It extends concrete defense obligations, backed by the military might of every member, into new territory.
And you have to consider all the risks and costs that implies for the whole group.
For collective security, yes.
So if we look at the core mechanics, the whole structure of accession boils down to two legal clauses in the North Atlantic Treaty. What are these twin pillars that candidates have to satisfy?
They are Article 5 and Article 10. Let's start with Article 5.
Famous one.
It's universally recognized as the core of NATO's purpose. It's a collective defense guarantee.
An attack on one is an attack on all.
Basically, yes. An armed attack against one member is legally considered an attack against all, triggering a collective response that can range from political consultation all the way to military intervention.
So this clause means that every new member instantly becomes a shared defense responsibility for the entire alliance.
Instantly. Which forces all the other allies to do a very thorough, very sober assessment of the strategic risks involved with extending that promise.
Okay, so that's the guarantee. What about the front door? Article 10 is the entry mechanism itself. What does it demand?
Article 10 defines the precise admission criteria. There are three key requirements. First, the candidate has to be a European state. Simple enough.
Check.
Second, they must be able to further the treaty's principles. This is, the democratic governance and rule of law requirement.
The political and values part of it?
Right. And third, they must contribute to the security of the North Atlantic area. But the most significant hurdle within Article 10 is the requirement for unanimous agreement.
From all existing allies.
All of them.
That unanimity constraint is what truly makes the path a political minefield, right? You only need one country out of what will soon be 32 to veto the entire process.
Precisely. The need for consensus means that the candidate has to persuade every single capital, not just a simple majority, but the most skeptical capital, that its membership strengthens collective security.
So it's not one negotiation, it's 32 separate negotiations.
It is. It transforms the whole thing from a high-level policy discussion into 32 separate political calculations, each assessing their own national interest, their internal politics, and the strategic risks of extending Article 5.
It's a massive political obstacle that you can't overcome with just military progress.
No, not at all.
Now, let's look at Ukraine's starting position. It's a distinct case, right? It combined genuine, hard-won strategic assets with some very visible structural weaknesses.
A very unique profile for a candidate country.
On the asset side, Kyiv has locked in a constitutional commitment to Euro-Atlantic integration since 2019. That is a critical legal signal.
It tells the alliance this isn't just the fleeting preference of one government.
Right. It's a long-term national project supported by their own fundamental law.
And then there's the public support. We also see extremely strong public consensus supporting membership, particularly since 2014.
Which you need. That gives the Ukrainian government the political ballast to pursue the really difficult institutional reforms that NATO requires, even in wartime.
And, of course, the most critical part, their military assets are striking.
Striking is the right word. We are talking about a large, battle-hardened military.
Huge.
And one that's currently integrating Western systems and doctrine while under high-intensity combat conditions.
Think about that. They have operational and institutional experience facing a peer adversary that very, very few current NATO members possess.
That experience is invaluable. You can't simulate that.
You can't. And that operational experience is already positioning Ukraine as a potential contributor of high-value skills, not just as a consumer of security.
What kind of skills are we talking about here?
Well, they have gained hard-won, cutting-edge expertise in specialized areas. Things like large-scale drone warfare coordination, sophisticated electronic warfare,
Things NATO is keenly interested in.
extremely interested in, and also maintaining an integrated air defense network under constant attack. This directly aligns with NATO's requirement that new members should enhance the alliance's overall military capacity, not dilute it. They bring operational lessons that the West needs.
Okay, so those are the remarkable strengths, but despite those, the sources are clear. The gaps are currently decisive.
They are.
The ongoing war and institutional weaknesses are the major counterbalances. We have to look at these three constraints because, for the foreseeable future, they are locking the door to accession.
The first and most obvious constraint is the escalation risk.
The Article 5 problem in a live war.
Exactly. The risk posed by extending Article 5 into a live, large-scale war. Ukraine is engaged in continuous combat against a nuclear-armed neighbor.
And the mathematical result of that equation is just devastating for accession right now. Admitting Ukraine now means legally extending the collective defense guarantee into an active war zone,
Which allies fear would immediately test Article 5.
in the most dangerous direct confrontation scenario possible between the alliance and a nuclear power.
The calculation for allies is, simply put, about survival. They have to assess the risk that enlargement in wartime could trigger a direct NATO-Russia confrontation.
And that's viewed as an unacceptable risk.
For many, yes, under present conditions. The potential cost just outweighs the immediate strategic gain.
And it's important to say this analysis isn't a reflection of Ukraine's worthiness or their fight.
Not at all. It's a test of NATO's collective risk tolerance concerning existential escalatory risks. The institutional structure of NATO demands collective defense.
And collective defense demands collective risk avoidance when the risk is that high.
When the risk is catastrophic, yes.
So even if we could somehow overcome that immediate war risk, we run straight into constraint 2, territorial and deterrence ambiguity.
This is where the map starts creating legal problems.
The problem of occupied and disputed territories, Crimea, parts of the East, parts of the South, it creates these agonizing questions regarding how Article 5 would apply.
And we must stress again, these are not just abstract claims on a treaty map.
No, these are front lines.
These are zones of recent or ongoing combat involving large troop formations and heavy weaponry. They are currently the front lines of a major war.
Right, so if Ukraine joined tomorrow, allies would have to immediately decide. Does Article 5 apply to all of Ukraine's internationally recognized borders?
Which would mean NATO is committed to helping liberate Crimea.
Or does it apply only to the territory Kyiv actually controls at that moment?
The danger is that if NATO is silent or vague on this question, it severely risks undermining the clarity that makes NATO deterrence credible in the first place.
Deterrence relies on a crystal clear red line.
It has to. If potential adversaries cannot determine which lines NATO is prepared to defend, the guarantee loses its meaning, and that creates instability for every current member.
So that ambiguity is an unacceptable liability for the alliance.
It is.
Okay, let's move to the third constraint, which is more internal. Institutional fragility and trust. This is a quieter, less explosive issue than war, but no less critical for the alliance's long-term stability.
Absolutely. The alliance rests on trust. It requires members to maintain stable institutions of governance and uphold the rule of law without question.
And this is where the governance issues become strategic liabilities. Despite remarkable progress made by Kyiv,
And they have made a lot of progress.
many NATO capitals still perceive Ukraine's institutions as vulnerable to informal influence. Allies are naturally cautious about importing unresolved internal governance problems into a system that relies so heavily on mutual confidence.
Especially when you're dealing with classified intelligence and joint military planning.
That is precisely where the corruption risk becomes a critical security factor. Persistent corruption, particularly in the defense sector, isn't just a financial problem.
No, it's a security risk.
It could fundamentally erode trust in Ukraine's ability to securely handle sensitive Western technology, intelligence, and defense funds.
Which transforms a domestic political issue into a critical internal security issue for the entire alliance.
And that fragility has a direct impact on the military structure itself, doesn't it?
It does. Weak rule of law and uneven enforcement can undermine the required effective civilian control of the military.
How so?
Well, it complicates defense procurement, it raises questions about oversight, and ultimately it raises concerns about importing uncertainty into the alliance structure itself.
Yeah.
NATO cannot function if there is doubt about who is truly controlling a large armed force within the alliance framework.
So we have the external constraints war and borders, which are currently insurmountable. But even if the war ended tomorrow, Ukraine also has a massive internal dual roadmap to execute.
Which is necessary to meet the standards of Article 10.
Right, so let's devote some time to these three internal pillars because they represent Ukraine's first and most fundamental responsibility.
The first pillar is deepening democratic governance and rule of law. And this goes way beyond just holding elections.
Of course.
NATO expects aspiring members to transition from, emergency wartime improvisation toward stable institutions that can withstand future political shocks and function predictably in peacetime.
And central to this is judicial independence. It is one thing to pass a law on judicial reform.
It's another thing to make it real. The sources emphasize that courts must be credibly insulated from oligarchic influence. They can't just be formally independent on paper.
They have to demonstrate it.
They have to demonstrate independence through credible rulings and consistent application of the law, which is a significant undertaking given the history of the region.
And what about corruption?
The anti-corruption resources must be robust and permanent. Anti-corruption bodies like the NABU and SCPO must have the necessary resources, the legal authority, and the political insulation to pursue cases wherever they lead.
So they have to be able to go after entrenched patronage networks and ensure true transparency.
And this has to be a structural change that is sustainable, even when the acute pressure of wartime mobilization and Western oversight eventually fades. It's about building institutional endurance.
That concept of enduring institutional control leads directly into the second pillar, ensuring deep, effective democratic accountability over the forces that have won this war.
A huge challenge.
Mm-hmm.
NATO expects prospective members to establish firm civilian and democratic control over their war-hardened forces.
Why? To actively prevent the emergence of a politically autonomous warrior caste.
That phrase, warrior caste, is a signal. It's a signal about NATO's own institutional history and its concerns. They are looking for long-term democratic stability.
Which means the military must be firmly and unquestionably subordinated to democratically accountable authorities.
Primarily the Ministry of Defense and the Parliament.
And this accountability must be institutionalized across the board. Ukraine needs to refine and clarify chains of command in the post-war environment.
And dramatically strengthen parliamentary oversight of defense policy and budgets.
Which means robust, independent auditing and public reporting of all defense procurement contracts.
Right. This transparency reassures allies that their massive support is not being diverted, and that the defense establishment operates under full democratic scrutiny.
Also, promotions and appointments must be governed strictly by professional merit and criteria.
Not political loyalty. This ensures the military leadership is professionalized and predictable. A force the alliance can trust implicitly in joint operations.
Okay, Pillar 3, continued military modernization and interoperability.
This is a huge, complex conversion challenge. Ukraine has to rationalize and standardize its military so it can integrate fully and smoothly with allied forces across the entire spectrum of conflict.
What does interoperability mean in practice?
It means adopting compatible communication systems, joint doctrines, unified training standards, and standardized logistics across ground, air, and naval forces.
So even though they are currently integrating Western gear, that's not enough.
No, a deliberate peacetime program is necessary to fully phase out the vast stockpiles of incompatible legacy equipment and transition completely to NATO standards.
And as we mentioned earlier, Ukraine needs to be a contributor, not just a recipient.
Yes. They should refine and formalize their specialized capabilities, where they have gained that hard-won expertise, things like integrated drone operations, electronic warfare, and sophisticated integrated air defense systems.
By presenting itself as a provider of high-value skills, Ukraine enhances its political case for accession.
It does. And finally, there's the resource expectation.
You have to pay to play.
Aspiring members are expected to devote serious long-term resources to defense, moving toward benchmarks like spending 2% of GDP on the military. This demonstrates not just willingness, but the fiscal capability for long-term planning.
So Ukraine can maintain modern forces without relying solely on external aid.
That's the goal.
Okay, we've established the current obstacles and the internal roadmap. Now we turn to the most volatile factor, the outcome of the war itself. The sources present three major scenario-based pathways, and they dramatically change the political and legal feasibility of accession.
Right. Scenario 1 is the easiest path, though, perhaps the most remote.
Restoration of borders and cessation of hostilities.
This provides the clearest logic for enlargement.
The logic here is overwhelmingly straightforward. If Ukraine regains effective control over its internationally recognized borders and large-scale hostilities cease, it removes the two biggest obstacles simultaneously.
The war zone status and the problem of contested territory. Gone.
For NATO, extending Article 5 would then be viewed as locking in a favorable peace and consolidating a new security order rather than, gambling on an uncertain battlefield.
The pathway becomes relatively uncomplicated once those internal democratic reforms are verifiably completed and unanimous consensus is reached. Crucially, the risk calculation changes.
From triggering a conflict to stabilizing the peace. Okay, but then there's scenario 2, which is the difficult path. A frozen conflict with stabilized front lines.
This is where things get very complicated.
Active fighting diminishes, but significant parts of Ukraine remain under effective Russian control without a comprehensive peace treaty.
This scenario forces allies into agonizing questions. If NATO admits Ukraine with a frozen conflict line, are they prepared to treat every localized border skirmish along that contested line as a potential Article 5 trigger?
Risking escalation every time.
Right. And Ukraine would argue that Article 5 is needed precisely to deter renewed, large-scale aggression in this perpetual standoff.
This is where we need to get into the technical rigor of accession. If the path is this difficult due to contested territory, what does that creative legal solution the sources mentioned look like? I know they reference the West Germany precedent.
That analogy from the Cold War provides a potential, albeit politically painful, model. When West Germany joined NATO in 1955, the treaty was ratified, but Article 5 was effectively carved out regarding the legal status of East Germany and Berlin.
So accession did not constitute an offensive military mandate to unify Germany.
That's right.
So applying that to Ukraine, it would mean admitting Ukraine while explicitly affirming that Article 5 applies only to the territory Kyiv actually controls at the time of accession.
Exactly. The political claim to occupied regions like Crimea and parts of the Donbass would be pursued exclusively through non-military means: diplomacy, legal action, economic pressure.
This arrangement requires a clear, binding understanding that membership is not a mandate for offensive operations to retake land by force.
It does.
But isn't a partial guarantee almost worse than no guarantee? Doesn't limiting Article 5 to current administrative control simply formalize Russia's gains?
That is the core dilemma.
It almost incentivizes them to push the line further, knowing NATO's red line has been explicitly drawn short of Ukraine's internationally recognized borders.
And that's the fear. This solution risks blurring the clarity of NATO deterrence, which, as we said, is based on absolutely crystal clear lines. It makes achieving that unanimous consensus significantly harder because it requires members to accept a compromise that arguably validates Russian occupation.
It stabilizes the front line, but destabilizes the legal definition of the alliance's purpose.
A very difficult trade-off.
Then scenario 3 is the constrained path. A negotiated settlement with special arrangements. This involves a formal peace treaty being reached that embeds specific legal conditions.
Conditions designed to prevent Ukraine from fully integrating into Western security structures.
In the most restrictive version, Russia might successfully demand a legal commitment within the peace treaty that Ukraine will not join NATO.
Blocking membership by treaty for a defined period. Ukraine would have to weigh this against the perceived value of other territorial concessions or guarantees embedded in that settlement.
And a less restrictive, conditional version.
The settlement might impose specific confidence-building measures agreed upon by all parties. Things like contractual bans on permanent foreign military bases or heavy weapon deployments in specific regions near the Russian border.
So accession would remain legally possible in that version, but it would be politically fraught.
Very. It forces allies to decide if extending Article 5 to a state whose military is contractually constrained, prevented from hosting foreign bases, for instance, would genuinely stabilize the post-war order, or if it instead imports new structural vulnerabilities.
Moving beyond these specific war outcomes, we have to evaluate the alternatives to NATO membership. Why is NATO, anchored by Article 5, so crucial that other options just fall short?
The alternatives fundamentally lack the credible, legally defined framework for deterrence that the North Atlantic Treaty provides. Take neutrality and self-reliance, sometimes dubbed the Fortress Ukraine model.
Right.
Ukraine's history before 2014 showed this was a vulnerability, not a shield. Formal non-alignment did not prevent Russia from seizing Crimea and fostering conflict in the east.
Neutrality only functions if all major actors respect it. When a powerful neighbor views a neutral state as a legitimate sphere of influence, neutrality quickly becomes a deadly vulnerability.
It does. Even a heavily armed, self-reliant fortress, Ukraine remains exposed to coercion, hybrid warfare, large-scale cyber attacks, and targeted missile strikes that it cannot deter alone against a determined nuclear-armed adversary.
Then you have bilateral security guarantees.
These are significantly more fragile. Their credibility rests heavily on the domestic politics of individual guarantor states,
They're vulnerable to changes of government.
to shifting public opinion or fiscal constraints that can appear overnight. And Ukraine has bitter experience with this fragility. The failure of the Budapest Memorandum is the prime example.
We should dedicate a moment to the Budapest Memorandum failure because the informed listener needs to understand why those guarantees failed.
The memorandum was signed in 1994. It offered security assurances by Russia, the US, and the UK in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear arsenal. But crucially, it was structured as a political statement.
Not a legally binding mutual defense treaty like Article 5.
Exactly. It lacked any institutional enforcement mechanism.
Yeah.
When it was tested in 2014, those signatories consulted, but they had no legal obligation to provide military intervention or even formalized sanctions.
The guarantee just evaporated when it was needed most.
It did. And bilateral arrangements also lack the institutional depth that gives Article 5 its practical weight. The standardized planning, the joint doctrine, the interoperability standards, the integrated capabilities.
So they're best seen as temporary supplementary measures, not permanent substitutes.
I think so. Then we also hear about the Israel model, extensive external security support outside a formal alliance structure.
But this strategy risks creating a gray zone of expectations and obligations.
It does. Russia might test the edges of this informal arrangement precisely because it lacks the formal, public clarity of Article 5 commitments.
How does that gray zone affect Moscow's risk assessment?
Well, Moscow understands that an attack on Israel might provoke a massive, immediate U.S. reaction, but that reaction is based on political alignment and historical partnership, not a legal obligation.
It's not guaranteed.
It's not guaranteed. Article 5 provides that guarantee. The absence of Article 5 means Moscow's risk calculation is different. They might believe they can apply pressure or hybrid warfare without crossing a defined, treaty-enforced red line.
And finally, what about the EU?
EU guarantees, while providing important economic resilience and institutional reform momentum, lack NATO's integrated military command structure, standing defense planning, and long-practice mechanisms for joint operations.
EU membership can't fully substitute for a defense alliance where the United States and other key military powers are structurally engaged in that defense planning.
They're complementary, not substitutes.
Okay, now we turn the tables to NATO's responsibilities. Accession is a two-way street. It requires NATO to change itself and the strategic environment.
NATO has its own critical set of responsibilities, starting with intellectual and political clarity.
They have to move beyond vague, generalized rhetoric that Ukraine's future is in NATO.
Right. It needs to achieve a shared, politically binding understanding of whether Ukraine's eventual membership is a core strategic goal they are committed to pursuing, or if that phrasing is simply a rhetorical placeholder masking enduring ambiguity.
Clarifying that strategic intent requires a serious internal debate among all allies.
About deterrence, acceptable escalation risks, and the long-term relationship with Russia. Without this shared vision, which means 32 capitals agreeing on the desired end, state divergences among allies just translate into cautious, vague language.
Not a clear invitation and roadmap.
Once that consensus is forged, NATO must design a phased pathway. It has a political and operational responsibility to transform that vision into a practical conditional roadmap.
One that clearly links Ukraine's concrete internal reforms and the resolution of the war outcomes to specific, measurable integration steps.
And these can't be abstract goals. They have to be framed as clearly defined milestones on a conditional road to membership with verifiable benchmarks.
This transparency helps Ukraine prioritize its reforms.
And critically, it helps allied governments justify continued expensive support to their own citizens by showing tangible progress toward a stated strategic goal.
Furthermore, NATO must provide robust interim security guarantees.
These arrangements have to be substantive enough to shape the strategic environment and actively reduce the risk that Russia will exploit Ukraine's non-member status before Article 5 can apply.
What do those interim guarantees look like?
Concrete commitments, Long-term training programs, sustained equipment supply, deep intelligence sharing, and potentially long-term rotational military presence from allied nations within Ukraine's current borders.
And designing these guarantees in a way that is credible to Moscow, reassuring to Kyiv, and acceptable to skeptical domestic publics.
That is a central political and military task for the alliance right now.
And finally, institutional preparation is necessary on NATO's side.
Yes, the alliance must adapt its own command structures, planning logistics, and reinforcement routes for a much extended eastern flank. New security commitments have to be matched by adequate defense spending and capability development among existing members.
The burden of Ukraine's accession will fall on all parties involved in the treaty.
It will.
Let's synthesize these findings for the listener. Ukraine's pathway to the alliance is clearly not a single road, but a branching set of possibilities entirely contingent on the political and military outcomes of the war.
And membership requires a comprehensive dual effort. On Ukraine's side, they must consolidate democratic, rule of law, and civilian control reforms. This is their first and most fundamental domestic responsibility.
And on the alliance side, NATO must achieve unanimous political consensus on accepting the new security frontier and all the risks that accompany it.
The essential recurring hurdle that defines the entire process is always Article 5.
The challenge of transforming that guarantee from a legal mechanism that would trigger immediate involvement in a live war
into a stabilizing mechanism that definitively locks in a durable peace and eliminates strategic ambiguity.
The criteria for NATO membership require a democracy that is institutionally stable, politically predictable, and free of deep internal fragility. So consider this as you process the information we've reviewed. Which of the three required internal reforms, rule of law and governance, civilian control over the armed forces, or military standardization, do you feel is most likely to slip or reverse once the acute pressure of wartime mobilization and Western oversight eventually fades? That long-term institutional staying power, years after the peace treaties are signed, is what truly determines a candidate's readiness for the long haul.